Hi there and welcome. Watching David Davis yesterday was a tonic. His passion, his mastery of the facts of the case, and his forthright words about the compromised basic health of babies, suboptimal care, and the direct roles of two consultants in deaths Miss Letby has been convicted of should shut up many of the sad people out there who are so emotionally challenged that they can only feel good about themselves by seeing Miss Letby as a serial killer. It was telling that he made no mention of Thirlwall. He knows it is a sham which will eventually come to be recognized as a charade. Today, I'm going to talk about a subject which is not as uplifting as Mr. Davis's performance yesterday. Quite the opposite, in fact. It is a subject that will make watching uncomfortable for some, and one I am not that comfortable in having to talk about. It is a fact that at some point between when she was charged in November 2020 and brought to trial in September of 2022, Miss Letby's defense went from being part of the solution to being part of the problem. Based on how things appear to have gone down in the jury room and the failure of the application for leave to appeal, it is probably fair to say that her defense became her biggest problem. That might sound a bit strong, but bear with me, and I think you'll come to agree. Since the Lawfare project was initiated against Miss Letby in May 2017, initially just to buy time against impending clinical negligence claims, there have been three pivotal events. The first was the scandalous decision to charge her on the basis of character smears and fabricated circumstantial evidence behind a fig leaf of pseudoscience. The second was the informationally impoverished jury ultimately buckling under pressure and convicting her on 14 of the 22 counts. The third was the rejection of her application to appeal a couple of months later. All three events were obviously huge reversals, but if we put to one side the sheer hell of the 23 months on remand with no meaningful human society and only 1 hour out of her cell per day walking around a yard as exercise, the latter two events were the ones of greater significance. I'm going to show you that review of those two biggest reversals, 14 guilty verdicts in August 2023 and the refusal of leave to appeal, have one indelible common factor to them. And that common factor, unfortunately, is the decision by the defense to agree in advance of the trial that insulin poisoning of child F and child L was accepted to have taken place and would not be contested in the trial. My recognition of this began with a 5-minute video I saw last Saturday of an interview of Dr. Adele Ismail, a consultant in clinical biochemistry. Having done that deep dive into gateway case Child F, which hopefully some of you will have watched or at least watched a part of, I was already aware that the insulin poisoning convictions were the most readily challengeable both scientifically and procedurally. That's probably got a lot to do with the fact that the insulin science is the only legitimate science in the whole case. Anyway, I still chose to watch though, as it is always interesting to listen to an expert who is actually an expert. In watching, I didn't learn anything new about insulin science, but what I did learn was that the two insulin cases were in fact the first verdicts reached, both unanimously. The other unanimous one being Breary's baby O. In the context of my knowledge that Mr. Injustice Goss had needed to intervene in order to break the deadlock, and my previous awareness of insulin poisoning being an agreed fact, this gave me a whole new perspective on what evidently took place in that jury room, together with newfound surging respect and admiration for a number of those jurors. The fact of 13 days of deadlock is incontrovertible proof that there were morally engaged persons in that room heroically fighting tooth and nail to exonerate Miss Letby. Given poisoning was an agreed fact, those jurors actually subordinated rationality to instinct, intuition, and common sense on those two insulin cases for that whole 13-day period. In effect, they succeeded in denying for a whole 13 days a fact as immutable and self-evident as our knowledge that the earth is round or even gravity itself. This is so because a jury room, like the court itself or the very legal system, is an alternate, pared down version of lived reality. That alternate universe is modeled on lived reality, and it resembles it in many respects, but is qualitatively different in other features. One of those features is that, in contrast to lived reality, where our personhood screams at us that Miss Letby did not poison or otherwise harm any baby, inside that room, reality was that child F and child L were poisoned with insulin, leaving no more scope for dispute than the proposition that 2 plus 2 equals 4 does. The jurors fighting to exonerate Miss Letby did not have a leg to stand on in relation to those two cases. When the fact of insulin poisoning being a given meets with what is, in practice, zero scope for producing a further suspect, Miss Letby, as the only suspect, had to be convicted in the insulin cases as surely as night follows day. For that hardcore of jurors to have managed to successfully hold their ground for 13 days in those circumstances is a rearguard action on a par with what those 300 Spartans did against Xerxes' 100,000 plus army at Thermopylae. We should also not be surprised that, despite having been deadlocked for more than 2 calendar weeks previously, the jury now ran wild, adding a further 12 convictions. Insulin poisoning was a buy one get one free, so that was 30 years right there. If someone is going away for 30 years anyway, does it really make a big difference to them or anyone else if it is whole of life instead? Those insulin cases are what broke the logjam to the multitude of convictions. On perfectly reasonable inference then, based on events as we now know them, the agreed fact of insulin poisoning opened the door to Miss Letby's 15 convictions. Worst was to come though. The lack of casework on air embolism due to its esoteric nature, and the sheer scientific flakiness of the idea of triggering cardiac arrests and lung function collapses in babies by either aerating their stomachs or giving them too much of their own mother's milk rendered the insulin cases the most potentially intelligible and therefore fertile ground in terms of appeal potential. Unfortunately, as it had been conceded for the trial and the appeal team was the same that had conducted Miss Letby's defense at trial, it could not be an argument at appeal and therefore did not form part of the application. Just to be clear, in consequence of that application to appeal being refused, Miss Letby is actually in a more precarious position legally now at the beginning of 2025 than she was back on the afternoon of 18th August 2023 after being convicted. As I hope is now clear, this all lies at the door of that decision to accept that the 2 babies had been poisoned, despite neither suffering permanent damage and normalizing within 17 hours in one case and 28 hours in the other. That is a much quicker recovery than would have been the case if either child had caught a chill and developed the sniffles instead of allegedly being poisoned. Given the impact of poisoning acceptance on Miss Letby's judicial fortunes, it is not unreasonable to ask questions to, if nothing else, get some understanding of how the defense came to make so manifestly catastrophic a decision. After the scandals of the Birmingham Six and the Guildford Four in the 1990s, a duty of disclosure was created in English criminal law, whereby the prosecution is obliged to disclose to the defense any otherwise unused information or material it has in its possession which might undermine its own case or assist the defense case. The fact, certainly in the Child F case, that the neonatal unit did not send the sample away to Guildford for full assessment, and the fact of a disclaimer on the label of the Royal Liverpool University Hospital immunoassay that the test was not fit for purpose for insulin testing are both things which would fall squarely within that disclosure requirement. The actual words on that test package is as follows, I quote: "Please note that the insulin assay performed at RLUH is not suitable for the investigation of factitious hypoglycemia. If exogenous insulin administration is suspected as the cause of hypoglycemia, please inform the laboratory so that the sample can be referred externally for analysis." End quote. I think even the Lucy Letby haters out there would have to agree that conceding the point on poisoning could not be in Miss Letby's best interest if the decision maker had knowledge of those flaws in the prosecution's insulin cases. It therefore follows that either 1. The prosecution did not disclose the information, or 2. Miss Letby's defense team included a person or persons with decision-making power whose priorities were not limited to Miss Letby's best interests. I do not wish to take a position on that question, but for my own integrity must make 2 further points. Even in the absence of disclosure, solicitors' firms have junior staff, trainees and interns to do that kind of routine due diligence information search on a big case like this, which would have had to unearth the fact of the disclaimer on the test at the very least. The second point I must make is this: Miss Letby's defense team would have been able to construe the same significance that I have delineated to the insulin verdicts being the first to be decided. They would have seen the damage done to their client by the concession of poisoning. The application to appeal was mid to late autumn 2023. During the month of September 2023, Sarita Adams published several posts on the Science on Trial website utterly demolishing the insulin cases. Yes, I know that she's at loggerheads with Peter Hitchens and apparently was not actually awarded her PhD. But just so we can have some context, if I'd been given the documentary resources she used, while it would have doubtless taken me longer, I could have written those posts, and I don't even have a science A-level. It wasn't rocket science and did not involve going into a lab to do tests. It was just about finding the right reference documents and reading them. In any case, in the circumstances of autumn 2023, Science on Trial was the largest, most high-powered and highest-profile entity in the campaign for Miss Letby. As such, her legal team had to have had eyes and ears on it. They had to know just how vulnerable the insulin convictions were. Given that As a trial team, their hands were tied on making Insulin a point of the appeal request. But those of a new team would not be so tied. It is plain that the original team would have shown greater commitment to Miss Letby by volunteering to step aside in order that the most potent appeal weapon could be part of the appeal under the auspices of that new team. Okay, so that's what I had to say to you today. Please feel free to share your own thoughts and any information you think might be of interest in the comments section below. As usual, thank you for watching. Thank you for your time, and all the best.